The first time I saw queer characters in media was when I was watching The Walking Dead. I knew what being gay was, but I never saw anything that was explicitly queer, just subtext I recognized years later when I learned what queer subtext was. The characters in question were Tara and Aisha, a sapphic couple who, in The Walking Dead show's usual fashion, only were a couple briefly before the show killed Aisha off. I remember being disappointed about that, but I rooted for Tara to someday get herself a new girlfriend. Before... well, watch the show yourself and find out. Someday I'll catch my white whale of a Walking Dead media analysis video, but today is not that day. Today is a special day, or rather, one of the 30 days that makes one special month. It's Pride Month! And speaking of, happy Pride Month to my fellow queer people! For today's video, I want to talk about some of my favorite queer characters, my thoughts about them, and some other things involving the shows that they're in and the writing for said shows. A lot of these characters are important to me personally, while others I added in because I wanted to talk about the media they're in and how they handle the topic of queerness. I will be drawing these characters along with the video, so we'll start with our first character, Daryl Dixon from The Walking Dead. So a long time ago, there was an article that came out from an interview with Robert Kirkman, the creator of The Walking Dead, where he confirms Daryl Dixon to be a heteromantic asexual man. Although he phrased it as Daryl being just straight, saying they played Daryl as Dixon as a somewhat asexual on the show, it was still a surprise to learn as someone who adored the character before this reveal. I got into The Walking Dead at the very day Season 2 started airing, and I was immediately hooked. And like a lot of fans of the show, Daryl became my favorite character. So to find out a character who I really liked at such an early age, before I even knew I was ace, and then finding out later that he also was ace, was really cool. I still adore him for that, even though I have fallen off with The Walking Dead since Season 8. The most I got into the later seasons was when I was looking into the show and seeing if it ever actually directly handled Daryl's ace identity. This was when I was doing an essay for my critical sexuality class back in early 2023. I wanted to write my essay on asexual and aromantic representation in podcasting, and had a section on what makes that different from what asexual and aromantic representation is like in mainstream media, i.e. lots of TV shows and movies. Unfortunately, I use Daryl as one of my examples of how ace identity is underrepresented in mainstream media, because in all my research I couldn't find anything that's confirmed if it's ever brought up in the show itself. Since they briefly shoehorned in a romance with Daryl, with a character that the show spends very little time with, it could have been a way for them to explore Daryl's sexuality in the narrative. But because the show only handles their romance post-romance with Daryl, we don't really get to see it. It's very disappointing. I like queer characters being able to exist in media without having to make an emphasis on their identities all the time, but asexuality is so underrepresented in media, more so for aromantic characters, and I'd like to have more canonically ace and aro characters who bring their identity up without the only shows I can bring up that do that being BoJack Horseman or Sex Education. Or just podcasts. Podcasts, you would get so much ace and aromantic rep. Also, exploring queer identity in a post-apocalyptic setting would have been so good, and Daryl's a perfect candidate for that because of asexuality's underrepresentation and Daryl just being such a prominent character in the whole series. It would have been a really great character plot to go with him since he has been around since the very beginning. An 11-season show. Maybe we'll see that in any of the spin-off shows, but since the white whale that is the Walking Dead analysis video is still swimming around in my head waiting for me to make it, I personally don't have too much hope that they'll actually go through with it. AMC, please stop being cowards. Still, Daryl Dixon is asexual, and I still think that's cool, and they can kiss my butt. Can't take that away from me. Now let's go back to our year 2014, because we need to talk about the OG of main animated protagonists in queer relationships. Specifically in animated children's media. That's right, we're talking about Kora. I grew up on Avatar: The Last Airbender, and when they announced the last season of Legend of Korra, I had to give the original show a rewatch and finally watch The Legend of Korra myself. I think the show gets way too much flack than it deserves. There's obviously some writing choices I personally wouldn't have made, but overall I really enjoyed Legend of Korra, and I think people give it too much flack for not being too much like Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's like a different time period with a different set of characters who are a completely different age from the original main protagonist. I really don't know what you people want. It was a good show with the 1920s steampunk vibes I love, and I like Korra's more mature development, which was different and kind of more relatable versus Aang's younger development that was relatable to me back when I was around his age. Considering Kora was closer to me in age, it made sense, but it was new and an interesting way to write a character for this universe. We love a show that grows with its audience. Adventure Time does it with Fiona and Cake. But of course, we can't forget the queer rep in Kora, which, although was not as much as what we expect today, it was amazing back then. I remember the very day that they had Korasami become canon. This was a year before Garnet and Stronger Than You came out, before the Rooffire Wedding, or even Bubbling being canon. In the show, it wasn't much. Kora and Asami held hands at the finale of the final episode when they planned on going vacation in the spirit world together, but it was confirmed very soon afterwards that it was a sign of the creator showing that yes, Kora and Asami are a couple. And not only that, but there's comics about their relationship now, rather than just leaving it at the creator said so, which I think is nice. It's not the first anime show to have queer subtext in this way, but it was the first with the main protagonist, at least that I know of, and the first one I could think of. I think it's important to remember the original shows that started paving the way to have more queer rep in media, because yes, queer representation in media has changed, but not recognizing milestones when they happen because they're not quote-unquote good enough for today's standards is very limiting, because it took a lot to actually get to that point, and it's fantastic to see where we came from since then. I took multiple film and animation history classes since I've been back in college, and they have taken the time to talk about the Hays Code, which, if you don't know what that is, was a series of self-imposed rules the film industry made after various laws were being passed in states thanks to various religious and other groups. They didn't like the content in films, and they wanted more censorship in certain topics. I suggest going and reading more about it, but some of these rules included certain kinds of profanity, drugs, and a lot more rules, and sexual perversion, which included queer relationships, was one of the big don'ts in the Hays Code. Eventually, they started removing those rules one by one and replacing them with the maturity ratings we have today, but positive, non-tragic queer rep was one of the last things to actually be able to be on film without them technically breaking the law. Stuff like this is important to know about these days. When I hear younger people talk about shows like Rocky Horror Picture Show or even Legend of Korra not being good enough representation, they don't realize that for people my age, and even for people who are older than me, that was the best we got. It took people behind those shows to insist on including queer rep in them, and yeah, we flipped out when Kora and Asami held hands. It was like a really big thing back then. It was huge for a lot of people, and look how far we've come since then. I mean, in 2014, we had Kora and Asami holding hands to signify that they're in a relationship, a romantic relationship. Then, less than 10 years later, we get Luz, who's the main character of the Owl House, dating her girlfriend Amity midway through the show, and consistently act like a teenage couple throughout the show. On Disney's channel, no less. Thanks Kurosami and the creators of Legend Korra for what they're able to pave the way for. They deserve your thanks. You should be on your hands and knees thanking them. Now, it would be absolutely criminal of me to make this video and not talk about Jmart, so I'm gonna ramble a bit about my favorite boys. I love these guys so much. You have no idea. I know so many people love them, but I love these guys so much. And I wasn't expecting to either. I knew about the Magnus archives for years before I actually listened to it, but I wasn't aware that they get into a relationship during the show until I'd started and I was a bit into the first season. Whereas a lot of people got into the Magnus archives after they heard about Jmart, I got into it because I was like, ooh, spooky horror podcast where Karim Kronfli plays a character. I have to go listen to it because I love the SCP archives, which was the only other horror podcast I was listening to at the time. So I gave it a listen, and I was hooked. So hooked on it. Oh my goodness, it's one of my favorite shows ever. When I first started the Magnus archives, I was aware of some of the characters. I knew who John and Martin were, but I thought Martin was a lot younger than he actually is, and John was a lot older. You can't blame me for that, because John canonically does look a lot older than he actually is. And I knew who Basira was by sight, but not by name, and I knew Elias was also a character, but I thought he had Tim's personality. I only had fan art to go by. And of course, like a lot of people, I knew who Michael was. Long Fingers McGee, the guy with the weird hands and blonde hair. It's very hard to not recognize him when he comes up in the show. I was interested in seeing how Jmart actually came canon because the time I found out that they do become a couple, I was 7 episodes into the first season, and I was like, John is such an ass to Martin. How does this happen? I'm not a big shipping person, but it got me intrigued because I was very curious to see how they go about with this. Now on my re-listens, I listen to John in season 1, I hate Martin rambles, and I go, yeah, sure bud, sure, put a pin in that. But their relationship is so good and intriguing, even for my not a big shipper heart. I love their development together, and the build up to the relationship is so bittersweet. It's just A+ romance writing. It's messy and sometimes not good, but I love how it's not a perfect romance, and it just adds on to the tragedy of the Magnus Archives, and just the curious wonder of what could have been like without the tragedy. And John being asexual is also a huge plus. I personally don't headcanon Martin as being ace, not because I don't like the headcanon myself, but because I would like to see more relationships between asexual and non-asexual people. Romantic relationships specifically. Although I'm in a relationship with my also asexual girlfriend, before we got together, I used to get upset with thinking about dating. The pool for other asexual people to date is small, and the pool for allosexuals who are fine with dating an ace person who is very sex repulsed is even smaller. A lot of people think romance and sexual desire are the same, but they're really not. I desired a romantic relationship someday, but not one that led into the expectations of being a sexual one. Luckily, I don't have to worry about that now because my girlfriend is awesome and also asexual, and both of us are like, ew, sex, gross. Having that kind of rep in media isn't explored too often, and I like to see that representation more. John is also just so gender, it's very hard to explain it. I know canonically he's a cis man, but he has such non-binary, gender non-conforming energy. Just biggest blurbo, 10 out of 10, best character ever. I love him so much. Johnny, thank you for giving us this sad, pathetic little man. He is just my favorite little guy. Love him to death. The Sil Versus is a podcast I talked about in the past, and it's one of my favorite shows out there. But one of the things I praise about the show for is making a fantasy world that feels like our actual world without being a carbon copy of our actual world. It feels a lot like a fantasy setting, one that doesn't exist, but while also feels very relatable to just how our current world functions. The setting is so intriguing, and I recommend anyone who wants a good, dark, tragic fantasy to give it a listen. But one of the things this show does so well is how it has its queer characters exist in this universe. The topic of queerness comes so naturally in a lot of discussions between characters, and the use of characters' pronouns or sexuality is never highlighted in a way to make fantasy homophobia or portrayed uncomfortably. Like, I think the closest this show has ever gotten to any kind of queer phobia to, talk about, not with characters being, explicitly queerphobic, is when Carpenter, a canonically aro-ace woman, talks about an entitled ex-friend from her past who was romantically interested in her while she was not, implying her not wanting to be with him was more of a self-loathing issue, rather than her just actually being aromantic and asexual. Now granted, Carpenter herself didn't know she was aro-ace at the time, but the feelings and thoughts she had about this interaction with that friend felt so real, and I related to it a lot. The Sil Versus is also just great with its non-binary rep, and having characters just casually using they-them pronouns without making it a huge thing they have to uncomfortably dig into is just a very nice way of just doing it. Shrew uses they-them, Gage uses they-them, Vaughn uses they-them, and nobody bats an eye towards the fact that their pronouns are just the conventional she and her and him and he. With the modern day weird thing transphobes have against using pronouns of all things, it's nice to have a world where it's like, yeah, we're a dystopia like you, but at least transphobia isn't one of the things that makes it dystopian. The Sil Versus also brings in so much discussions about classism, poverty, and the flaws of late-stage capitalism in such a well thought out way. The fact that the lower class is literally sacrificed for the appeasement of gods and the upper class doesn't blink an eye at throwing low-wage workers into the fire is such a dark, but well-thought-out way of comparing it to the modern late-stage capitalism the world is facing now. And how that ties into with relatable queer issues without relying on queerphobia to do it as well. There's a lot more I could talk about with the show in terms of just everything about it. I have a less spoiler-filled video in my channel recommending the show to people, but it's such a good podcast. Please give it a listen. Give it a chance. It is so nice. I could have drawn, most of the cast for this, but I ended up just sticking with Carpenter and Paige because they're my favorite characters in it. So this one is a more recent one for me because I just finished listening to the show and I wanted to draw them, but I really enjoyed Gundam The Witch from Mercury. And it's so funny to me to have a show like Gundam have a main bisexual or pansexual leads. I stuck with bi flag for this one, but I personally had Canon Mjolnir as pan. I personally wasn't into Gundam growing up, but my brother had a Gundam game he played obsessively, so I was very familiar with the series, which I'm sure most people already are, but having to watch somebody play through the same fight scenes over and over and over again certainly makes you very familiar with the game, much less the anime in the series. Funny enough, he never actually watched the anime. Mjolnir and Suletta are just so good, and I love how this show writes them, but god, this show puts them through the ringer. I was hooked throughout it, and the build-up for their relationship was just done so well, even if the nature of how they first got together wasn't the best. But I like that the show recognizes that, and that the two of them respected each other's space and wants until they started reciprocating feelings for each other. It also is nice to have a bisexual character who expresses interest in both men and women, even if Suletta was mostly interested in dating just boys before she and Mjolnir started falling for each other. I know other shows with bisexual rep do this as well, but I enjoy it when media acknowledges that bisexuality exists. The language doesn't really have to be used, but it's also very nice when they just try to go into it as much as they can without having the character go like, I am bisexual, I date man and woman, yay! Shows don't need to be explicit with it, but I like how they decided to go about with writing it. It's nice. Since we watched The Witch from Mercury, I watched it with friends, and we plan on watching more Gundam anime together. I have no knowledge of Gundam outside of the show, so it'll be very interesting to actually give it a shot and see if I like it. The last character I want to talk about is Todd Chavez. We all know him as one of the very, very few positive representations of asexual identities on mainstream media, but I didn't know how he was portrayed in the show that he's from, BoJack Horseman, as an ace character until I actually gave it a watch myself. I was pleasantly surprised with Todd's portrayal in BoJack Horseman. I had seen clips of him coming out to BoJack in the show, and the one scene where he's a group with other asexual characters, and they're explaining to him the different kinds of ace identities, whether they're sex repulse aces or not, or aero ace or not, and so on and so forth. But what surprised me was how much the show gave thought to the discussion of Todd's identity without making a joke out of it. Not to say that there hasn't been any comedic moments that didn't involve his ace identity, such as the episode where he and an ex-girlfriend of his go to meet her parents who are adult stars, but the comedy doesn't make his identity the joke. In fandom and some other media, I've seen aces as being portrayed as either these cute, sweet, naive babies who have never ever heard the S word, much less know what it means, or ever want to talk about what it means, versus other portrayals where asexual characters are shown as unreasonable and abusive for not wanting to do the sideways tango with their significant other. At most, characters with no canonical love interests may get a confirmed ace or aero ace identity label from creators, and that's really it. Now, I know that's more of an executive issue than the creators of the shows themselves, and I applaud creators of shows who try to get their asexual characters to give more leeway into the show about talking about their identity and everything. But it's so disappointing as an asexual person that the only good cartoon I could recommend with an asexual character that talks about asexual issues is just BoJack Horseman. And it's also refreshing for a show that is as popular as BoJack Horseman to talk about asexuality while not making it a joke, because BoJack Horseman is a comedy and they tend to make jokes about certain subjects that I think are done well, because it does it to point out more of whether it's the ridiculousness of certain real life issues or just a little bit of dark humor sprinkled in there, but it does it without making those issues seem laughable and still makes good ace jokes. So the comedy of the show is just so well done in general, and it touches up on just so many ace stuff in such respectful ways that doesn't feel really icky compared to like I said, I've seen it in other shows or in fandom, and I just really appreciate BoJack Horseman being a show that is able to do that. Much less kind of surprised that it's BoJack Horseman of all shows that we get really good positive asexual representation in it. Very surprising. Good on that show. And that does it for this video. Once again, happy Pride Month, and I hope you guys had a good one. Here are all the drawings I did all together. I got to draw most of these characters for the first time just for this video, and it was a lot of fun. I want to do more art videos like this and have some design videos and art challenges in mind, so those will have to come up someday. But speaking of, if you're a long-term follower of mine on my YouTube channel, you may have known or seen or even have listened to the actual play podcast that me and my friends have done, Revelations Nevada. Unfortunately, Revelations Nevada, as you could probably tell, has been put on the shelf permanently. There's been a lot of real-life stuff between me and my friends that have come into the way of us being able to consistently schedule the game, and we have decided that instead of just letting it have a quiet death, we're going to put out a video next month explaining all of the reasons to why we had to cancel the show, talk about character arcs and how we wanted them to go, whether it's what I had planned as the GM for the Monster of the Week game, because Resolutions Nevada was a Monster of the Week game, or what my players were hoping for their characters, depending on how the story went. And I'm happy to talk about it. So what I want from you guys is if any of you guys who are listeners of Revelations Nevada, whether you decide to go listen to the episodes of the show, which will be staying up on my channel even though we're not continuing it, and want to ask questions, you know, after you listen to it, or if you've been a listener of it for a while and you want to ask questions about it, go ahead and leave them. It could be about the characters, it could be just about me and the players. But one of the things that to keep in mind is, yes, we will be talking about plans for character arcs. So if you're like, what was Drake's arc gonna be like? We're gonna talk about it. It's character arcs, plans, my plans, monsters, creatures, all that. I'll be talking about every single little thing for that. So, you got questions? Just leave them down below and I will take a look at them and I'll put them together, and that will be like the big video I post out next month. And as always, you can follow me down below on all my socials. If you're a queer artist or a queer person in general and you like reading comics and you want a queer horror comic to read, I have one called In Harmony. You know, I never stop talking about it. It is my baby. I also have a sci-fi fantasy comic called The Shepherd of Oblivion, which also has a ton of queer rep in it. Give them a read and maybe consider joining my Patreon if you want to help me out. I currently only have updates for In Harmony as early access on there. As for people who may follow me on my other socials, The Shepherd of Oblivion is currently on a hiatus until I finish my fan webcomic. If you were watching this video, it's a Magnus Archives crossover comic. And once it's done, I will be getting back into The Shepherd of Oblivion. I already have a ton of plans for how I want to continue that comic. So anyway, thanks for watching this, and I will see you all later. Bye-bye.